She had never longed for grandeur or towering ceilings with crystal chandeliers. All she had ever wanted was a space of her own, honest, grounded, and quietly hers. In the fall of 2016, Marlene purchased a decaying brick townhouse on the outskirts of Syracuse, New York. The listing photos hadn't hidden the damage: a collapsed porch sagging like a broken limb, a roof that gave way to sky, and windows covered in grime thick enough to blur the past. But where others saw ruin, she saw potential. Not the potential for profit, but for peace. The first winter nearly broke her. Bitter drafts curled through the gaps in the window panes, and the heater, older than her, coughed more than it warmed. By day, she sketched structural layouts and renovation plans for clients scattered across the country. At night, she donned gloves and thermal socks and climbed up to the attic with a headlamp and stubborn resolve. She rewired faulty circuits with trembling fingers, patched crumbling drywall, and learned to recognize the difference between water stains and the creeping dread of mold. By the end of that first year, the house began to change shape. The broken porch had been replaced with thick cedar steps she sanded herself. The leaking roof gave way to weather-tight shingles, nailed one by one as she balanced on scaffolding in the spring breeze. There was no team of contractors, no friendly neighbor offering weekend help. Just her, a second-hand toolbox, and an ever-growing collection of bruises and calluses. It was hard, unglamorous work, and she never complained. Inside, she stripped decades of layered paint from the wooden banister until the original grain showed through. She cleaned out the rusted kitchen sink and replaced the linoleum with warm oak flooring. The walls, once sickly green and peeling, were now a soft ivory that caught the morning light like linen. She built her shelves, lined them with books on architecture and poetry, and drank coffee each morning beside the window that faced the neighbor's maple tree. The house didn't look like the ones on magazine covers, but it was alive, lived in, steady. Some nights, after long days of client meetings and late hours spent calculating measurements, she would sit cross-legged on the floor of her small office, surrounded by blueprints and tea mugs. It wasn't loneliness she felt. It was something quieter, more sacred. The house had become an extension of her, flawed, patched, and whole in its own way. Each corner held a story of perseverance, every repaired floorboard a silent vow not to give up. The space smelled of pine from the shelves and fresh coffee from the pot she kept on a timer. In the evenings, with soft jazz playing from a tiny speaker, and the warmth of her work soaking into the walls, the house felt like a heartbeat, her heartbeat. It didn't matter that she lived alone. The space was filled with air that didn't judge, walls that didn't expect, and a quiet that held her like a blanket. Her mother had visited once, after the drywall was finished, but before the furniture had arrived. She had stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and remarked that it looked less terrible than expected. But Marlene didn't need approval. Not then, not anymore. She had built something with her own hands, piece by careful piece. She had proven to herself what she already knew deep down, that she could build a life, even from rubble. 3 years passed in this rhythm. She took on more freelance work, designed for schools and nonprofits, and even declined a firm offer from a corporate firm in Chicago. The house didn't make her rich, but it made her feel rooted. For someone who had grown up in a home where her needs were often an afterthought, this small, imperfect townhouse was a revolution. She planted lavender near the mailbox and let the vines climb the trellis on the side wall. She built a narrow bench for the front hallway and stored her boots neatly beneath it. There was a place for everything now. No chaos, no waiting, no pretending. She'd look around some mornings, coffee in hand, and feel a deep breath rise from within. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was hers. Marlene never said it aloud, but she thought of the house as a conversation, between past and present, between what had been taken from her and what she had reclaimed. In the wooden beams and the textured walls, in the creak of the floorboards beneath her slippers, there was something sacred, the quiet knowledge that she had done this. With her hands, her will, and her belief that building something real, slowly, honestly, was still possible. In the spring of 2019, the call came just past midnight. Her mother's voice trembled between sobs, the words barely making it through. Her stepfather had been diagnosed with dilated cardiomyopathy, an aggressive form, the kind that left little time to plan. The doctors recommended surgery immediately. There were risks, but without intervention, he wouldn't last the year. The news didn't feel real at first. It hovered like fog on her skin, cold and clinging. She didn't hesitate. By sunrise, she had transferred $42,000 from her savings, the entire reserve she'd spent years building through late-night contracts and freelance work. She didn't tell anyone at work. She didn't pause to calculate interest or consider the upcoming property taxes. All she saw was the man who had raised her, now facing a fragile thread of life, and the woman who had once sung her to sleep, breaking on the other end of the phone. The hospital was quiet when she arrived, filled with the hum of machines and the hush of worry. He looked smaller in the bed, pale against the starch-white sheets, but when she walked in, he opened his eyes. There was something both grateful and apologetic in them. He reached for her hand, the grip faint but steady. For the first time in years, he looked at her not as an obligation or stepchild, but as someone who had stepped forward when no one else could. He didn't say much, just a few words through a breathing mask, but his eyes said more than language could hold. Her mother sat on the other side, holding back tears with a kind of dignity that only came from years of carrying too much. The surgery took 4 hours. She waited in the sterile cafeteria, nursing a coffee that had long gone cold, staring at the smudged window as rain traced uncertain lines down the glass. When the doctor came out with a tired nod and a thin smile, relief broke through her like light cracking open a sealed room. During recovery, she visited daily. She brought homemade soup in mason jars, fresh socks, crossword puzzles. She paid for a specialized nurse to ease his transition home. The nurses at the hospital knew her name by the end of the week. She watched him slowly regain strength, his movements shaky but hopeful. And with each small improvement, her mother repeated the same words like a prayer. "We will never forget this. The house is yours. We know what you've given." Those weeks softened something between them. Her mother hugged her again, the way she used to when she scraped her knees as a child. Tight, warm, without words. They talked over breakfast, folded laundry side by side, sat on the porch without needing to speak. Her stepfather began sketching garden plans, talking about building a shed together when he recovered fully. For the first time in a long time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, they saw her, not as a backup, not as someone to depend on only when things fell apart, but as a woman who had rebuilt her own life from broken beams and still had room left to give. The house, the one she had restored with scraped knuckles and sleepless nights, stood strong behind them. The paint still smelled fresh. The upstairs windows caught the light just right in the afternoons. It felt like everything she had poured into those walls had finally found a return. Not in money, not even in gratitude, but in trust, in belonging, in being seen. She didn't ask for anything in return. She never had. But when her mother rested a hand on her shoulder one quiet evening and whispered, "We'll never touch what's yours," it felt like a promise, a rare and sacred one. And she believed it, because families didn't betray each other. Because loyalty, when spoken aloud, was supposed to mean something. Because love, when given like that, deserved to be held, not used. She walked back to her room that night with a quiet kind of peace, the kind that comes only when you've done the right thing without needing applause, the kind that tells you that even if the world falls apart, you'll still be able to live with yourself. She had no idea what was waiting just beyond that peace. She returned on a crisp October morning, the kind where the air carries both the promise of change and the edge of something final. Her flight from Denver had landed before dawn, and after 6 months overseeing the reconstruction of a university library, all she wanted was to come home, to step inside her quiet townhouse with its worn wooden floors and the scent of pine still lingering in the corners. Her suitcase rolled behind her with a familiar rattle, and a warm coffee cup steamed gently in her gloved hand as she turned the corner onto her street. The house stood as she remembered it, solid, patient, its red brick facade softened by the turning leaves that framed the porch in gold and rust. But as she approached, she noticed a man kneeling by the front door. He was changing the locks, calmly, methodically, as if this had been his job for years. Confused, she paused at the edge of the walkway, watching the glint of metal and the quiet click of tools. When she stepped closer and asked who he was, he turned without surprise, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said he was Jerry's son. He added, almost casually, that this was now their home. At first, she didn't understand. Her mind refused the words, like a program rejecting invalid input. She looked past him toward the porch, at the door she had painted herself, at the crooked step she had repaired with her own hands, and then at the windows she had replaced during the first brutal winter in Syracuse. Nothing had changed about the house, but something had shifted irrevocably beneath the surface. Her mother emerged a moment later, standing just behind the stranger, arms crossed tightly, as if shielding herself from the cold or the conversation to come. She didn't meet her daughter's eyes. Instead, she murmured something vague about time, about youth, about how she could always start again somewhere new. That this wasn't personal, just practical. Her voice was soft, almost kind, as if kindness could soften the blow of betrayal. Only later did the full truth unfold like a document she had never been allowed to read. While she was away in Denver, immersed in blueprints and scaffolding, her stepfather had transferred the deed to his biological son. Quietly, efficiently, without consultation, he had claimed it was to simplify family holdings, to unite property under one name. No mention of the years she had poured into restoring that house. No acknowledgement of the $42,000 she had given to save his life. Just a signature, a transaction, a closed door. The neighbors watched from behind curtains, pretending not to notice. Her suitcase sat abandoned on the sidewalk, coffee cooling in her hand, as if time had paused to let her absorb the weight of this new reality. She didn't yell, she didn't cry. She stood still, listening to the hum of traffic in the distance and the dry whisper of leaves beneath her shoes. She had always thought betrayal would come like a storm, loud, chaotic, undeniable. Instead, it came quietly, in a voice that sounded like her mother's, saying things like, "You're still young," and "It's just a house." As if youth was a currency that excused erasure, as if walls built with one's own hands could be reassigned with a few strokes of a pen. That night, she stayed at a motel near the interstate. The room smelled like bleach and old carpet, but the silence was absolute. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, her body still aching from travel, her mind unable to settle. The betrayal wasn't just in the act, it was in the ease with which it was done, in the way no one had thought to warn her, to ask her, to consider what that home had meant. It was the assumption that she would understand, accept, even nod in agreement as her life was quietly rewritten. In the morning, she returned once more, not to plead or argue, but to collect what little she could. Some documents, a toolbox, a few photographs. Her mother wasn't there. The man who called himself Jerry's son stood watching from the porch but said nothing. As she turned away for the last time, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The house had already been taken. What remained was the knowledge that her trust had been misplaced, and that from this point forward, no one else would hold the pen to rewrite her life but her. She didn't scream. She didn't argue. She didn't even ask them why. That kind of pain didn't come with noise. It settled in silence, deep and steady, like water soaking into the cracks of something long weathered. When she stepped away from the house with her suitcase rolling behind her, the latch on the gate clicked with finality. It was a sound that would echo later when the quiet became too loud to ignore. That evening, she sat alone in the corner of her rented motel room, its walls bare, and its air tinged with the chemical stillness of a place made to forget. She unzipped the side pocket of her suitcase and pulled out a folder, the one she'd carried with her since Denver. Inside were the latest sketches for an eco-library, the early outlines of a rural housing project, and an unfinished plan for a solar workshop that she had once dreamed of building on the edge of her now lost backyard. Each page smelled faintly of ink and pencil, touched by the heat of long nights and the weight of ambition. These were not just drafts, they were pieces of herself, months of focus, slices of solitude, everything her hands had built when no one was looking. She flipped through the pages slowly, not in mourning, but with a strange detachment, as if saying goodbye to a part of herself she'd already outgrown. Somewhere between the fourth and fifth page, a realization crystallized, not like a flash of insight, but like something that had always been there, waiting. They hadn't stolen her house. They hadn't even betrayed her in some new, unexpected way. They had simply revealed, with the ease of people long accustomed to taking, that her sacrifices had never been seen as real. What had felt sacred to her was disposable to them. What had been built with love is, in their eyes, just property. Transferable, replaceable, useful. By morning, her decision was made, not with fire, but with clarity. She packed every sketch, every notebook, and every tool she owned. She canceled her auto drafts, liquidated the contents of her freelance accounts, and posted a short message in the design network she trusted most. Projects for sale, full rights included. Serious offers only. By evening, everything was gone. Within 48 hours, she'd tied off the life she had spent years building in Syracuse with the precision of someone used to exact measurements. No explanation, no fanfare. Just clean lines, quiet steps, and one final click of the light as she left her studio for the last time. She sold what furniture she hadn't salvaged from construction sites, returned the spare keys to her landlord, and closed the old email address where her mother still sometimes wrote with updates she never answered. In the final hours before leaving the city, she stopped by the hardware store one last time, not for repairs, but to pick up a travel case sturdy enough to carry her tools cross-country. The cashier, a boy barely 20, looked at the drill bits and sanding discs with a curious glance, but didn't ask. She liked that. She liked being a stranger again, a woman in motion with no backstory to explain. That night, as she crossed the state line under a pale moon, she rolled the window down just enough to let the cold air sting her cheeks. The map on the passenger seat glowed faintly under the dashboard light, and the road stretched forward in quiet invitation. She wasn't running. She wasn't escaping. She was choosing. In the rearview mirror, there was no silhouette of the house, no fading outline of her mother's figure, just the smooth darkness of a road left behind, and the solid hum of an engine moving steadily forward. She had learned that silence is not weakness. Sometimes it's the only language strong enough to hold the weight of everything unspoken. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need confrontation. What she needed was a place where her effort wouldn't be treated like spare change, where no one would assume her hands were free for their convenience. She didn't know exactly where that place was yet, but she had a direction, and more than that, she had herself, untangled, unowned, and ready. And as the miles unfolded beneath her wheels, she let the quiet settle not as grief, but as peace. The kind of peace that comes when you stop asking to be valued and simply start building a life that reflects your worth. In Boulder, the air carried the scent of pine and earth, as if the mountains themselves breathed slowly through the valley. She arrived with nothing but a car full of tools, a suitcase of weathered clothes, and a mind emptied of apologies. The town wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet. And for the first time in months, that was enough. She rented a modest wooden workshop on the edge of town. It used to be a storage barn, long abandoned, with crooked shutters and ivy creeping up its side. But it had bones. Good ones. The kind of place you could trust to stand through storms. Inside, the floors creaked with honesty, and the windows let in a kind of golden light that made everything feel possible. She set up her drafting table in the far corner, beneath a high window that looked out toward the hills. By day, she designed skeletal frames of homes meant to hold women who'd once been pushed out of family plans, told to wait their turn, or expected to give everything and take nothing in return. Each design was deliberate. No wasted space, no unnecessary flourishes. These homes weren't meant for show. They were built for shelter, independence, and quiet pride. She thought of them as letters to the version of herself who had once stood in her own yard, watching someone else change her locks. Now, she worked with purpose. Not for clients with deep pockets, but for women who showed up with stories, not demands. Women like her. In the evenings, she pulled on gloves and turned the soil behind the workshop. The backyard was wild when she arrived, full of weeds and stubborn rocks, but she coaxed life from it the way she once coaxed structure from ruin. She planted thyme near the stone wall, where it would soak in the heat of the day. Tomatoes went in next, near the trellis she built from salvaged fence posts. Each plant became a kind of vow. This time, every inch of ground would be hers alone. The town moved slowly. Neighbors waved, but no one asked too much. At the Saturday market, she bought honey and eggs from a woman who didn't know her name and didn't need to. She liked it that way. In this new place, her worth wasn't tethered to family dinners, to whispered promises in hospital corridors, or to the silence that used to follow her generosity. Here, her effort wasn't invisible. It was in the frame of the porch she repaired, the seedling rows that stretched straighter each week, the calluses on her hands that didn't ache with regret. Sometimes at night, she'd sit on the porch with a mug of tea, watching the light fade behind the mountains. The silence wasn't empty, it was full of possibility. She no longer had to brace for footsteps in the hallway, or wait for another betrayal dressed in concern. No one knocked without permission. No one asked for her name to be signed beneath someone else's plans. It wasn't a loud kind of happiness. It didn't sparkle or announce itself. But it settled deep, like roots in warm soil. She still had scars, of course, moments she couldn't forget. But they didn't define her anymore. They were part of the architecture of her past, but they no longer dictated the structure of her future. She worked with a steady rhythm. Some mornings began before the sun rose, her breath visible in the cold air as she sketched under a single lamp. Other days passed in slow stretches of planting, sorting wood, tuning her tools. She received letters from former clients, women who had moved into the homes she'd designed. Each note a reminder that her work meant something, that what she built endured, even if the people who once called her family had failed to do the same. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic reinventions, just steady, quiet steps. And in those steps, she rediscovered what it meant to be free. Not untouchable, not hardened, just whole, with no need to explain or prove anything. She was alone, yes, but for the first time, she was truly home. That spring, a letter arrived. Familiar handwriting on the envelope, slanted and careful like it always had been. Inside, her mother's words unfolded like something rehearsed, yet still barbed. You left as if it didn't hurt us, but you've always been too independent for your own good. There was no demand, no apology, just a quiet guilt woven into every line, a reminder of how little they understood her even now. She didn't write back, not out of spite, not out of pride, but because something had shifted deep within her, a slow, deliberate change that no longer required permission or explanation. There was a time when such a letter would have rattled her, stirred up old aches, and brought back the endless cycle of trying to be understood. But not anymore. Now, silence was not absence. It was peace. It was a choice. She spent the following days walking the perimeter of her land, boots sinking slightly into the soft spring earth. The tomatoes had taken root. The thyme spread low and wide like a gentle guard around the edges of her garden. There were birds nesting in the tree she'd trimmed just weeks before. And when she passed by, they didn't startle. They knew her presence. They trusted her quiet. Her workshop was no longer just a place for design. It had become a sanctuary of process. She kept every blueprint, not just for clients, but as a record of how far she'd come. The shelves were full of notes and sketches, each line a decision, each angle a reminder that her hands could shape not only structures, but the shape of her life. She hung no photographs from the past. There were no family portraits, no holiday memories framed in gold. Instead, The walls held her own work: unfinished drawings, dried herbs, a calendar filled with her own milestones. She had created a life where her worth wasn't conditional, where her boundaries were not negotiable. And slowly, that life became less about escape and more about intention. She met new people, locals who knew her only as the woman in the pine house who grew mint that smelled like memory and built homes that never wasted a single beam. Some asked questions, most didn't, and she preferred it that way. Each evening, she made tea and stood at the edge of her porch, watching the light soften across the hills. It was a kind of ritual, a small affirmation. Not everything needed fixing. Not every wound required a response. She no longer carried the weight of being misunderstood. That burden had been set down, gently but finely. Sometimes the ache of old memories flickered through the quiet. A dinner table, a hospital hallway, the sound of a suitcase wheel on pavement. But even those memories began to feel different, not softer, but smaller. Like looking at a house she once lived in but no longer called home. There were no grand triumphs, no revenge, no dramatic redemption arcs. Just a woman who chose to stay, to plant roots where no one else would, to build something no one could take from her because it was never built for their approval. She had drawn the blueprint of her life with firm, steady hands, and she had followed it, even when others called it selfish, even when they begged her to return to a script that no longer fit. Her home wasn't large, but it held everything she needed. A window facing east for the morning sun. A kettle that whistled like a gentle reminder. A chair that held her weight without protest. And a door that stayed closed unless she chose to open it. She had not disappeared. She had simply stopped asking to be seen. She had not hardened. She had simply stopped bleeding for people who never noticed the wound, and she had not given up on family. She had redefined it, made it something earned, not owed. That spring, as the trees bloomed and the hills turned green again, she didn't send any letters. She didn't explain where she'd gone or why. She just lived, fully, quietly. And in that quiet, she found what she'd always been searching for: not a place to be accepted, but a place to be her own. The house she had lost was never really home. This one, shaped by her decisions and lined with her boundaries, finally was.